YouTube and things like that. So we'll have teachings that are available for other people to enjoy, even if they couldn't come out at 7:15 on a Monday night, which may be a hard time for some. The topic of this evening's lecture, which is only going to run about 30 minutes if I can keep my eye on it, is Sacred Jerusalem or Ancient Jerusalem. And the idea here is in anticipation of our congregational trip this July, where we are actually going to be in Jerusalem for a couple of, or a vessel or a statue that backs up the claim that I make today. And you're going to experience those things and go, wow, that's amazing. This is real. This history is real. Our legacy is real. Then there are other things that are biblical. And I won't say that are just biblical, because our Bible itself is also a depository of real experience and wisdom. But I recognize that in the political winds of the Middle East today, not everyone sees our Bible as an authoritative document. And so when you talk to people who are invested in denying any Jewish connection to the land of Israel, or any legitimate claim on any part of Jerusalem, you have to know when you're talking from our faith tradition and when you're talking from archaeology. I like to quote Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of blessed memory on matters like this, and that is, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but no one is entitled to their own facts. And there are some things here that we will say are facts, and there are other things that I have to admit are a matter of my religious opinion. Nevertheless, the goal here is not modern politics. The goal here is sacred background, understand what Jerusalem means and why, how it got there. So to do that, we have to go way, way back. We have to go way, way back. We're not talking going back to medieval times, Crusaders. We're not talking about going back to early Islam. We're not talking about going back to Byzantine times or the church ruling. We're not talking the Roman Empire. We're not talking the Greek Empire. We're not talking the Persian Empire. We're not talking the Babylonian Empire. We're not talking the Egyptian Empire. We're not talking the Amorite Empire. We're not talking the Ugaritic Empire. We're not talking Mesopotamia as you were taught in your school books. We're talking about farther back than that. Farther back than that, the age of about 20,000 BCE to, let's call it 10,000 BCE, is known as the Early Stone Age. In the Early Stone Age, there were human cultures climbing around in the rocks and hills of what is now known as Israel. It was one of the populated areas of the earth in prehistoric times. We have archaeology remnants from these peoples. We have, for example, around in the area of Jerusalem, found arrowheads and bone tools and stone tools that identify people who were living there as being early stone or middle stone age. So you have to get to middle stone age, which is going to take you to about 1800 before the Common Era, in the Mesolithic age. And you have to understand what the land was. In this part of the world, what were things like in the year 20,000 BCE, before the Common Era? The year negative 20,000. What were things like in Essex County, New Jersey? Well, not dinosaurs, those are millions of years ago. There were humans here, the early Lenape and so forth were here, but they were very, very cold. They were very, very cold. There was still the end of a climate era of ice in this area at 20,000 before. It was very cold. That was the time of the ice bridge to Asia across Alaska and many other things. So the land of Israel climatically was not like the land of Israel today. In the early Stone Age, the land of Israel was actually fairly lush. The hills had richer sediment. It wasn't as rocky. The forests were not everywhere, but certainly in all of the valleys. All the dry runoff wadis that you see today probably had streams and rivers in them. It was actually quite a nice area. People did not need to organize for urban centers, specialized labor, or agriculture because it was easy to forage for food. We know this because not only of the archaeology of widespread human, not settlement, but existence in that area, but the nature of the existence, the nature of the tools and so forth. When you get out of that period, by the time you get to 8,000 before the Common Era to 4,000 before the Common Era, which is a classic Middle Stone Age, that the climate change has been happening. And whereas this is becoming a livable area, that's starting to dry out. And the land of Judah, the land of Israel, these mountain areas, start to become more like what we see them as today. It's a browning of that area. This decreases human settlement and increases the need for human cooperation. And you start to see some of the first pre-urban centers. And what you really see in the archaeological digs is you start to see a better variety and sophistication of stone tools, which characterize the Middle Stone and then the Late Stone Age. That's what's happening around Jerusalem. Okay? That's what's happening. Now, the Torah really begins its story at the dawn of the Bronze Age. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are Bronze Age people. They're fairly late Bronze Age people, or early, depending on whose chronology you want. But it's very clear from the technology in those texts and the timeline that comes out of them, that's Bronze Age. And as a matter of fact, the Bronze Age was pretty good for the land of Israel. And you had multiple tribes and peoples and multiple languages living in that area. Their theology was pantheistic, multiple gods, almost all of them associated with nature. Makes a whole heck of a lot of sense with the drying of the natural resources, that a need to find blessings was driving the imagination of the peoples who lived there. The need to find blessings in cattle and blessings in rain, which we see even in our biblical literature. Those are themes that are very important to the culture of that area. The blessing of cattle, the blessing of fertility, the blessing of the land, the blessing of rain. It's even in the Shema paragraphs that are carried down to this age. It comes from that time. In fact, the patriarchs and matriarchs, that period of time for us, was Bronze Age folks out there in the rural hills learning how to really farm. And farming is in the hills at this time. We see cisterns being dug, we see wells being dug, and we see them being dug in limestone hills, like Jerusalem, and not in granite hills, like Har Gerizim, because bronze tools can't cut granite, but they can cut limestone. So the technology of the day is actually matching the geography of the land. Jerusalem is capable of some excavation. Jerusalem also has, running around it, it's a peninsula. Did we find any markers?
Oh, you don't have to put your
Okay.
hand.
I'm going to try.
It should say dry erase.
What's that?
It should say dry erase.
Yeah, I know, it should, but I've got one that's kind of half wiped out. Nah, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I don't want to do it. Okay, so imagine Jerusalem is a peninsula. Okay? It's the shape of my shape. Okay? You're looking straight down on a peninsula, and it has a kind of a wadi going on one side, a wadi on the other. And on the eastern side of that peninsula, it has a natural underwater aquifer spring, which has been flowing water now for all measured history. So that means for at least 4,000 years, that spring has been active. That would have been a very attractive place for settlement in the conditions that I was describing. So the Jebusites are what the Bible says were living there. So let's take a couple of biblical things. Now I'm going to do the archaeological background. The archaeological background is before the patriarchs and matriarchs come along, you got some people living there, they've learned how to farm, they've learned how to master water, they're living according to what the hills will give them, and they have a deep belief in the theology of fertility, rains, and blessings of the rain. Good? Okay. So what's the first place Jerusalem is named in our Bible? Because this is going to be a Jewish story, not an archaeological story. First place Jerusalem is named in our Bible. It's a trick question, because the word Jerusalem doesn't show up in any of the 5 books of Moses. But the city does. The city does. People like to say the city was founded by King David. Absolutely false, and even the Bible says that's false. I don't know where people get that one. It was because it's called the city of David, I guess, so they think he founded it. Not true. Well, believe it or not, in Jewish legends in the Midrash, everything is Jerusalem. So you come out of the Garden of Eden, you're in Jerusalem. Adam was in Jerusalem. All this stuff is in Jerusalem. There's no textual evidence in the Bible for that. The first place Jerusalem exists is in the Abraham stories. You may recall that in chapter 14 of the book of Genesis, Abraham goes to war. There's 5 armies on one side and 4 armies on the other side, and he becomes like a clan chief among the people living in his new land. And he's already wealthy, and evidently he's powerful. He wins the war, and then he starts heading home. And it says, when he returned, this is verse 17 of chapter 14, when he returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, which is the valley of the king. And King Melchizedek of Shalem brought out bread and wine. Shalem, like Yerushalayim. Yerushalem. Okay. So Shalem, King Melchizedek, my God is Tzedek, my God is just. And he is, it says, he was a priest of God Most High. He was a priest of El Elyon. Anyone know anyone else who claims to be a priest of El Elyon in our Torah stories? I'll give you a hint. It's this week's Parsha. All you need to know is the name of the Parsha, and you got the right answer. Yitro. Very good. Yitro, who is the father-in-law of Moses many generations later, also in Midian, in the Sinai Peninsula, claims to be a priest of El Elyon. So the idea that there are natives in this area who believed in a God on high is actually a common, not a startling thought, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're praying to our God. It probably means that they're praying to the Zeus of their pantheon. Of course, I'm importing that from European mythology. But the idea of the head of their pantheon being El Elyon, the God on high, is the one here. So this means he's a very powerful priest of a very powerful king and a very powerful priest of a very powerful God among some very powerful people. In a city that was worthy of being named in the first chapters of our Torah, which means it's a city with an ancient legacy. People would have believed this city was there way back then. But what's really interesting about this guy is he combines 2 things. And this is part of what Jerusalem becomes for us. Already here, he's combined 2 things. If he is King Melchizedek, thank you. If he is King Melchizedek, priest of El Elyon, what 2 things have been combined? Secular and religious. He is the king, which means he's in charge of what? The land. He just had a bunch of wars. He's probably in charge of some fighting men. Yeah, he's got power. He's got people willing to kill for him and willing to defend him from being killed. He's in charge of the land, which means prosperity, which means trade. He's in charge of economics, he's in charge of power, and he's a priest of El Elyon. He's in charge of theology. So he has, in this city, combined secular and religious power in a way that no other non-Jewish city of the ancient world is described. And that is precisely what Jerusalem will become for us. It's a combination, the seat of secular and religious power, which means it was already that before it was ours. So first of all, the inherent sense of Jerusalem, when people want to talk to you about Jerusalem should be an international capital of all peoples, right? There was that utopia some time back, 50 years ago, so people thought that Jerusalem should be an international city. Jerusalem has never been an international city. The very character of that city for thousands of years, no matter who has been there, has been a combination of secular and religious. There's no such thing as secular and religious. In fact, the most successful attempt at secular and religious is not an attempt, it's happening now. You have religious parties and secular people in the Jewish people who are arguing with each other about how to run Jerusalem. Haven't really seen that other than now with us, with all things. Okay, so that's the earliest point. When does that happen? Well, let's place Abraham for fun somewhere between 1800 and 1400 before the Common Era. That's important because that's basically the period of time of the end of the Bronze Age. That's the last phase of the Bronze Age. We know that Abraham was the end of the Bronze Age because after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what happens? They go down to Egypt, and what happens? Pharaoh, with his iron chariots and his iron weapons and all these things. This is a technology war. That's what's going on in the book of Exodus. It's the people of the Bronze Age fighting the people of the Iron Age. And the people of the Bronze Age are winning, which is miraculous. That's really what's going on here between these cultures at that time. And that battle is taking place up and down between the Philistines and the Israelites, as well in the early Bronze Age. So, we're going to jump ahead a little bit to David, the whole David and Goliath story. What does David have? A rock. What does Goliath have? An iron sword. Right? It's not subtle. It's not at all subtle. We just are so far past both of those technologies that we don't see what a remarkable difference they are. Right? It would be like somebody with a bow and arrow fighting somebody with a repeating revolver. You know, it's just not close as far as the technology. Okay, so what else do we have here? So we get the patriarchs and matriarchs really don't spend time there. The one thing that does happen is that Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac on a place that is referred to as Har HaMoriah, the Mount of Moriah. And we do have a later text, much, much later in the writings, like almost 1,000 years later, that equates Zion with Har HaMoriah, those two, which means you have to go back and say Abraham was sacrificing Isaac on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But the early text doesn't seem to locate him in that place. Most of the patriarchs and matriarchs live down south around Beersheba, or halfway between Beersheba and Jerusalem in Hebron, in the hills south of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's not a center for Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah. They're southerners. So when we go on our trip, what we're going to do is we're going to start in Jerusalem, and we're going to see the ancient stuff, plus what happened later. And then we're going to back up in time and go see where Abraham and everybody lived, down in the desert. All right, what happens next? How does Jerusalem become truly important? Well, David does come and conquer it. David doesn't just walk into it, David conquers it. David is a military commander, and in the second book of Samuel, chapter 5, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron, and he said, "We are your flesh and your blood. Long before now, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led Israel in war. And the Lord said to you, you shall be a shepherd of my people Israel, a ruler of all Israel." The elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a pact with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. So David becomes king over Israel. Okay? He's replaced Saul. David is 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years, 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all of Israel and Judah for 33 years. So that's what we've got. We've got David as the first ruler of Jerusalem. Can we claim that Jerusalem was ours from the beginning of time? No. No, there's no claim that Jerusalem was ours from the beginning of time. People who take all the Midrashim and the legends and they say the Garden of Eden was Jerusalem, and Noah was in Jerusalem, and then they go on and they go, Abraham sacrificed Isaac, or was going to sacrifice Isaac in Jerusalem, and they make all these things Jerusalem. Well, then they've got texts of God saying, look, this is the place that I promised to you and your family forever. Did God promise the land to Abraham? Yes. Did that include Jerusalem? Yes. But that doesn't mean that we founded it, it was always ours. And the Bible doesn't try and make that claim. The Hebrew Bible doesn't do that. There is a prehistory to us, and it's not prehistoric. There's actually historic history prior to us. However, there is the record as well as of the conquest and when it happened. And it happened a really long time ago. What's the best date you could give for King David? Got to guess. Let's drop Moses down on the timeline. If Moses is real and that happened, when is Moses happening? Well, it's Pharaoh, store cities have been built, Iron Age, some people are still Bronze Age. It's not too far off from about the year 1200. It doesn't make any sense if it's 1350 before, and it doesn't make any sense if it's 1050 before. Whatsoever. Those stories in the book makes no sense whatsoever as far as everything present in those stories. So you're going to drop it in around 1200 before the Common Era. Which means 40 years later, you've got the children of Israel entering with Joshua. Joshua does not really conquer Jerusalem. It's interesting. We don't have that so much. Joshua doesn't seem to completely conquer the entire land at all. It's sort of mixed still after him. And you have the period of the judges. Deborah and everybody else. Well, they're going to last a while. They're going to last with the judges for at least 100 years. So if you go from 1200 plus 40 plus 100, you're in the 1060 era. And then you got to have time for Samuel and Saul, and then David. So a good day for David's 1,000. Call it 1,000. It's not bad. It's not off by 50 years, I'll give you that. 950 would be pretty late. 1050 probably way too early. If it's off, it's in the 900s. Okay? So that's David. David is conquering the Jebusites in this land, because it says here, the king and his men set out for Jerusalem. against the Jebusites who inherited the region, and David was told, "You will never get in here. Even the blind and the lame will turn you back." You know, that's taunting from the parapets, right? Now you have to understand, they had good reason to say that. Why do they have good reason to say that? Well, I'm going to pass out some materials here that are a little gray, but you're going to get to know them better. When you first look at it, you're not really going to see what's going on here. But then you will. Pass to the back, please. On the front page, looks like this, big gray box. On the back page, pretty color picture. Okay? Look at the pretty color picture. And let me help to orient you. I am looking south. I am looking south over the old city of Jerusalem. I am looking towards Beersheba from the north. I am looking south. The Dome of the Rock, the blue building, the blue round building with the gold dome on it, is the Temple Mount. That is right where the ancient temple was. Absolutely. Now, if you go just beyond it in the picture, you'll see another building with a smaller blue dome. Just behind it to the left. Everyone see the smaller blue dome? That is actually Al-Aqsa Mosque. When you read about Al-Aqsa, that's the Al-Aqsa. The gold one is the Dome of the Rock. Al-Aqsa is one with the little blue thing. Okay? To the right of those two, and down 2 stories, is the Kotel Plaza. Open up the color page, and you'll see a picture of people at the Western Wall in 1967. Okay? We are going there. We will stand right there. We will stand right there. If you memorize the shape of a rock, or you bring it, that same rock is, you're going to go and you're going to touch that rock. Right there. Now you notice in 1967 there was no men's section or women's section. There hadn't been a men's section or a women's section in almost 2,000 years. Jews going. That's, the Haredim hadn't gotten control of this area yet. It was still just Israel. So, that is the wall that goes up, 2 stories up and over, turn back to the color, to the large flat area with the Dome of the Rock. So right here to the right of the Dome of the Rock, you can drop 2 stories down and the western wall's under there. Now, I want you to look to the left of both of those buildings, and inside the wall you see a large rectangular park-like area. See that? Okay? Go away from the camera and look over the wall, and you'll see on the left a slope of mountain with a bunch of little buildings on it. Looks like rocks. And you go all the way to the right, you'll see there's a valley in between. And all the way to the right, more roads going up to the left. And there's like a bowl in between there. And if you look really well, it looks like it's coming right out of Al-Aqsa Mosque. You'll see a road going straight away from you over a little hilltop. I don't know if your eyes are good enough to see it, but right behind that building, over the little hilltop, the little road going, that little hummock, that little bump, that little road, that is the city of David. When we talk about the city of David, it's that little bump, that little peninsula. And on both sides of that peninsula, there is a steep drop-off on both sides. And the Jebusites taunted David because they knew they could defend that. Because the only place you could get to it on foot was from that one side on the north. And the road into that on the north is not as wide as this building. This building is probably twice as wide as the peninsula and as narrow as part. So they could really defend it. They built a wall across and walls around the side, and that was a stronghold. So listen to what the book of Samuel says. How did we get this? They meant David will never enter here, but David captured the stronghold of Zion, and it is now the city of David. On that occasion, David said, "Those who attack the Jebusites shall reach the water channel and strike down the lame and the blind who are hateful to David. And that is why they say no one who's blind or lame may enter the house," which is a lot of weird stuff, except the water channel. Those who will strike down the city will reach the water channel. Remember I said there's a spring? The reason that that's a little peninsula is because of erosion of 2 streams that ran on both sides in ancient times, which is why I gave you the prehistory. One of those streets is still running on the east side. The wall builds around it so that the people inside can have water in the event of a siege. This saved the Jebusites. This saved David. This saved Hezekiah. This saved a lot of kings of Jerusalem because they had water in the city and they could survive a siege. They weren't going to get starved out because they had water. Well, David and his people, it's told in another story of the Bible, went into the water channels, crawled up inside, and like a Trojan horse situation, attacked from within, and that's how they conquered the city. Now, of course, they blocked all that off so other people couldn't do it to them. So it's an interesting story, and we've actually found those water channels. If you look at what I passed out to you, you'll see several outlines. The large block outline is the current walls. When you look at Jerusalem and you see the walls around the city of Jerusalem and you go, oh, there's ancient Jerusalem, and you get all teary, right? You see those brown stone walls and the gates, and they're magnificent, right? Those are Muslim and walls from the Middle Ages, from the times of the Crusades. The walls you look at when you look at Jerusalem are not from any part of Jewish history. Those walls are the big thick walls here of the fortifications from the times of Muslim Rome, post-Crusade. On the right, the dotted line starts to show you more of what the first temple, Jerusalem, looked like. And this section here, you see the big bold dotted line right down the middle of the big section? See where it curves right here? I'm going to put a circle on it. Right there, see that spot? That wall is about 20 feet thick and was about 30 feet high. Presumably the entire wall around was as well. That's the wall of Solomon. David built up the gates of Jerusalem and walls around it, and Solomon fortified it further. That's the wall of Solomon. Why did I circle that little corner? How do I know how big it is? They found it. And we're going to go see it. You can actually stand there and look down in the middle of Jerusalem with all the archaeology, and you have to look down about 15 feet in this one area in the middle of the Jewish quarter that nobody pays any attention to. But if you know what you're looking for, you can say, oh, there it is right there. And that's, you'll see a big chunk of Solomon's wall still out there. Fortunately, people throw garbage in and then they got to take the garbage out. But it's still there. The present day wall is just kind of for postcards. Now, on the right, you'll see the temple is a square here. That's where Al-Aqsa Mosque is. And that, you'll see the word Royal Palace. That's where the temple would have been and the Royal Palace. And then down below, there's a finger that sticks down like this. And that finger that sits down like this is the peninsula, and you can see the topographical lines, many sharp lines going down on one side, many sharp lines going down on the other side, and a fountain at the bottom. We are going to go to the city of David. There's a museum there with new archaeology in the last 10 years, where they have found more of the palaces and the buildings of King David. And they've actually dated them and the things they found in them. And then what I think is really cool is the space between the temple and King David. Unfortunately, nowadays there's a road that goes like this. You can't do any archaeology where the road is. But this area, the southern escarpment, they've been digging here, and they've actually got older and older buildings. They're into the first temple period again here, digging down in the archaeological part. What's that? Here, between the city of David and the Temple Mount. And I will walk you over to it, and I will show you how they dig. But because it's still new, we're not going to see too much. They're not going to present to us what they're doing. We're just going to watch them dig, which is a cool thing in and of itself, because they have these trolleys and buckets on ropes, and a lot of young people doing slave labor for their college credit. You know, it's kind of nice to watch the activity. And we're going to spend time there looking at it. Okay, so that's David and that's Solomon. It becomes under David the seat of royal authority, but not so much the religious place. It's under Solomon that it becomes a religious place. And under Solomon, it becomes world famous. Now, in the Psalms, you have certain kinds of pieties about Jerusalem, that it wasn't just a city of power. You have things like, God has made himself known in Judah. His name is great in Israel. Shalem, the city, became his abode, Sion, Zion, his den. There he broke the fiery arrows of the bow, the shield and the sword of war. This kind of power of a God living there, so the theology of the place, the importance of the place. During the exile, however, so we hold Jerusalem for a long time. Sennacherib in 722 destroys the north. He comes down and he tries from Assyria and he tries to conquer Jerusalem and he fails. He fails because of the walls. He fails because of the geography. He's there for some time and then some plague breaks out in his camp and the Israelites rejoice as a sign from God and they go limping home. However, Nebuchadnezzar has better luck. The Babylonian Empire comes in 586 and actually breaches the walls and destroys Jerusalem, and we are carried off into exile, into Babylon, in 586. So, back up. How long has Jerusalem been around by the time we get to the year 500? Before the Common Era? Remember, Jerusalem exists in Middle Stone Age. Middle Stone Age is 8,000 to 4,000 before the Common Era. So there have been people living in this area for 4,000 or 5,000 years by the time we get sent into exile. How long have we been there? We've been there about 500 years. We've been living there about as long as there have been Europeans in North America. 500 years, call it. Not bad. It's a good run. We're there for 500 years. And the temple is destroyed and we're taken off into exile. So in exile, we're living in Babylonia, and Jerusalem becomes the focal point. I like to say, and I like to argue, that this is the time that our relationship to Jerusalem is proven. Because up until that point, you could say it was just a city. How many cities of Jews had to leave because of war? Every single one except the ones we're living in now. Every single one. At some point, we had to leave. Right? How many songs are in the Siddur about any of those cities? There's no prayer in the Siddur about Krakow. Krakow was the seat of a flourishing Jewish civilization for centuries. One of the greatest publishing houses of the 18th and 19th century. A bustling cosmopolitan Jewish presence in Krakow. But of course, it became something else. Right? Centuries there. Nothing in the Siddur about Krakow. What about Alexandria, Egypt? Even in biblical times, we're in Alexandria. Great libraries. There was a temple in Alexandria to our God where priests, Kohanim and Leviim, sacrificed according to biblical law, contrary to Jerusalem. It was too far away. They were so content there and had been there so established politically and economically and religiously that they could hold all of the religion that was in Jerusalem they could do in Alexandria. Alexandria got destroyed. Did we cry for the loss of Alexandria? Did we write songs? Did we weep? Did the exiles of Alexandria return to Jerusalem? No. Because they weren't longing for Jerusalem. They had lost that idea. The ones who went to Babylonia never lost the idea. Jerusalem was what they wanted to go back to. It's interesting, the northern kingdom had been destroyed in 722. 140 years later, that the southern kingdom is destroyed. The southern kingdom's capital is Jerusalem. I also like to argue that if the northern kingdom had been around for the exile of 586, Jerusalem would not have been as important. Because they had their capital up there in Shechem. And there would have been split allegiance about where we were supposed to return to, Shechem or Jerusalem. The northern kingdom's capital is Shechem. They had a temple there, they had priests, they had all that stuff. But they didn't have that same connection. And when the people of Judah were destroyed and they went into exile, they never forgot Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, the Psalms, the most famous psalm from that time period, says, Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There in the poplars we hung our lyres, for our captors asked of us songs, tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion, they mocked. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? You hear that? How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? The exiles didn't think they could start life anew. Right? How's life in Essex County? Not bad. You feeling fulfilled? Happy? Good life. You can do everything you want here. It's a dream. It's everything your grandparents ever prayed for you. That you could have a full life. The American ideal is not challenged by Aliyah, because we think we can have it all here. That was not the attitude of the Jews living in Babylonia. They could not have it all there. They felt their prayers were not complete where they were. They could not sing a song to God on alien soil. And then they say, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. The destruction of Jerusalem in my happiest hour. Which is why we smash a glass at the wedding. Because of that. We remember the destruction of Jerusalem in our happiest hour. Same thing. So there was something about what it meant to lose Jerusalem that was different from any other city before or since. It generated a literature, it generated a faithfulness, and it generated a longing that those people had and documented. And when that kingdom was destroyed and Persia took over, they joined with the new conquerors, and Cyrus of Persia told them, you can go back. And he created on his far western flank a vassal state, Israel, under the Jews that would be loyal to him, and locked down that pathway to Egypt against foreign incursion. That's what he created. He loved it. And we loved it too. And Jewish kids got named Cyrus. There was Cyrus in this congregation. Sonny Kaplan is a Cyrus. Okay? All these years later, for that reason. Because the longing was palpable. When they got back, all of the literature of Ezra and Nehemiah in the year 500, 450, 400, where the Bible comes to a close, all of that literature documents challenge and fighting about how to rebuild the temple. Do they let us rebuild the temple? The local people aren't letting us. They're stopping us. We're going to get the Persian Darius is going to come back and tell them, you have to let us do this. It's all about Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Building it back up. And then the Bible comes to a close when it's built. That's the end of the Torah. That's the end of the Tanakh. That's the end of our highest level of sacred literature, is getting back and getting it built. And then I'll say Chaim, living life. And that goes on for centuries. Until the Seleucids come. We liked Alexander the Greek. We liked him. We welcomed him. He actually never came to Jerusalem. But we gave up the ship to him entirely. We said, sure, absolutely. Culture, peace, modern power, empire, you stay over there. We'll send you taxes. We're very happy. And it was only the generations after him that started to become oppressive. And then, of course, you get to Antiochus Epiphanes, and then you get the Hadrian story and the Maccabees. And you know what happens from there. But we weren't worried about foreign domination as long as we had Jerusalem. So ultimately what we gave up is we gave up ultimate political control because we still had the temple, we had our lives, we had the land, and that was fulfillment. That was everything we needed. So what if you pay taxes to Alexander? No one had a problem with that. People only had a problem when the Greeks started saying you can't be Jewish here anymore. That's when the problems started. When they started putting other statues and other religions into Jerusalem, that's when the problems started. Because Jerusalem was everything. It was the presence of God. It was the existence of the people. It was the identity. It was inseparable from who we were. It was worth dying for. And die they did. And for the Maccabees, it was worth being the few against the mighty. The Maccabean War started with Maccabees killing another Jew. Because the Greeks said, bow to the statue, and this guy did. They killed him first, and then they went after the Greeks. It was intolerable to the Jewish identity to think that you could have foreign religion and idolatry and all these things in Jerusalem, in the place, in the land. That doesn't work for us. They were okay with other people doing it. It was when it became coercive and oppressive and intrusive that they had the problem. And that becomes the nature of the fight. We brought the Romans in, by the way, too. We liked the Romans. Why did we like the Romans? Because they got rid of priests. Oops. Right? The Romans didn't go very well either. So what are we going to see when we're there? We are not going to see Greek archaeology. I'm afraid we won't see that. We will, however, pick up Roman archaeology. There'll be a fair amount of that. But most of the Roman archaeology is not particularly Jewish. So we'll point it out as we go. But what happened was, of course, when the Jewish revolt ended horribly, the Romans said on pain of death no Jews could be in Jerusalem, and they renamed Aelia Capitolina. And they basically scourged that entire area of any Jews on pain of death outside of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem does have a period of time when there are no Jews living there, and it's under Roman rule from about the year 200 to sometime over the next century or so, where Jerusalem is actually not continuous Jewish settlement. There are still Jews living in the land of Israel, but most of them are having a very hard time of it, and the Great Exile begins, which ends, of course, in 1948 on the pain of World War II. But when those people left Jerusalem, they not only felt the way the people who went to Babylonia had felt, they felt that plus 400 more years of living there. And everything about the world oppressing us or killing us was wrapped up in getting Jerusalem back. There was never a prayer of Jewish survival for the next 2,000 years that did not in some way contextualize itself as return to Zion. Surviving and getting a Shangri-La in Poland was never seen as redemption. It was never seen as success, as a people. It was always diaspora. It was always exile. Next year in Jerusalem was being said by the people who lived at the time of the destruction under Rome. They're the ones who put that in there. They're the ones who made the prayers for Jerusalem essential. It was already their feeling in their heart. And so when they went out, their entire identity was still a Jerusalem-centered religion. And that carried east to the academies of the Talmud in Babylonia, and it carried south to the communities of Yemen who corresponded with them, and it carried west across North Africa, in Egypt, and in Kairouan, in Tunis, and in Libya, and Algeria, across that area where there was Jewish settlement that was unbroken from the time of the First Temple. They all centered on Jerusalem, and their correspondence shows it. And the Jews who went with the Roman Empire, with the trading ships into Italy and into Germany and others across to Spain and then up into France, all that happening in the 5th century, and 6th century, and 7th century. They lived under the Goths, and then they lived under the Moors, they lived under the Muslims, and they lived under the Christians, all in Spain. Those people all carried the thought that all of these empires are transient and our ultimate return is Jerusalem. The exception is the ones who felt so confident of themselves, they named themselves as the exiles of Jerusalem. And those are the Sephardim. Sephardim does not mean Spanish necessarily, but it refers to a biblical verse about those who are the exiles of Jerusalem and the dwellers in Sephirah. So that idea of calling yourself Sephardi links yourself to a biblical verse that talks about being an exile from Jerusalem, from the First Temple even. So that their legacy there is more pure in some ways than the other people who showed up later after being in Germany or Italy or somewhere else. They said, we were First Temple pure Jews and then we're here. So we have an ancient society here of Jews who are exiles from Jerusalem. The only place better than where we are would be Jerusalem. The only people better than us would be the ones in Jerusalem. Even their identity, empowered and wealthy in centuries in Spain in the Golden Age, was linked to Jerusalem. So when life becomes destroyed in the 20th century, and the Zionist movement gets, Frenchmen had freedom. So you had to be a Frenchman to have freedom. In England, an Englishman would have freedom, but you have to be an Englishman to be free. So you have to either assimilate to be equal, free, and noble, or people would think, well, the Germans have a country, and the French have a country, the English have a country, and the Austrians have a country, the Swiss have a country, the Spanish have a country, and we don't fit anywhere. We need a country to be a nation like the other nations. Simple nationalism, 19th century romanticism, and so forth. So basically, the worldview of Europe is that if you have a language and you have a culture, you should have a land. And the land belongs to the people of the language and the culture. Well, to plop us down, in Wales wouldn't make any sense. Although the early Zionist movement did suggest Africa, and my favorite, Mexico. And there was actually land purchased in Mexico for a Jewish state. Oh, that's not my favorite. My favorite is there's an island in the Niagara River just upstream from Niagara Falls which was donated by a Jewish wealthy man as an international island for the creation of the Jewish homeland. I don't care how big it was. It's in the Niagara River above Niagara Falls. It is cold there. It's a lousy place to live. But it was pretty big. You could farm. You probably could put 10,000 people down there.
Or Uganda.
And Uganda. Yeah, that's a good one. Uganda was one of the good ones. None of those had the romance, because the heartstring wasn't to be Jews who are safe somewhere. The heartstring was to be Jews where we belong. And for all this time, we only belonged in one place. Now, there is then the second line, that there were always Jews living in Jerusalem. Not a lot, though. Honestly, not a lot. There were times when there were more, and there were times when there were less. Under the Tosafot school, the great-grandchildren of Rashi, 300 rabbis out of Germany and France all make aliyah together to go and establish communities in the land of Israel. There's other stories like that. Yehuda Levi comes out of Spain and he moves to Israel at the end of his life. You have multiple great characters who finish their life in the land of Israel and die there. When they get there, they found yeshivas, they have communities they're part of. There are Jews there. There are Jews there straight through. But was it a majority? Was it a significant powered part of the land? No, of course not. But there was continuity of Jewish dwelling there. Jews always go there. You can't say Jews don't belong here, we're foreign. Well, we all come from there. There are always Jews living there. We always hope to come back. And in all those generations, people kept visiting. So the connection isn't even just ideological. The connection is real, given the practicality of travel. And now look what happens in our day when you actually can travel. Right? I mean, you used to, if you got on the boat, you weren't coming back. Now you get on a plane. You're there for breakfast. Right? And look at all the people who go and travel. So the connection is clear. People want that connection. Even people don't want to make aliyah. It's ingrained in being Jewish. So Jerusalem started as a Stone Age Shangri-La. It dried up, and it became a Bronze Age challenge, forcing organized agriculture and urbanization. When that happened with the Canaanites, before we showed up, Jerusalem for some reason was special. Unlike any other town in the area, it was the seat of military and religious leadership combined in a single person, Melchizedek of Shalem, who Abraham knew. Over time, when we come back, it's still referred to in the Psalms and other places as the city of Zion, which we don't know what that word means at all. And the word Shalem, which some people think means whole or peace and all those things, that's just a modern drush. It's probably taken from the name of a Canaanite pagan god. The name Jerusalem, in its earliest form, exists in 14th and 15th century Egyptian literature before the Common Era. So we know it existed with that name before there was even active Hebrew in that sense. So it was a center of religious, spiritual hope for blessings, agriculture, the presence of God among a people who could defend themselves and protect themselves and live right here. And that's what it became under David, which became under Solomon, with the survival of the southern kingdom after the destruction of the north. It became the only depository of Jewish religious authority and imagination. And with the Great Exile, everything changed. And when we got back, we believed that God brought us back to Jerusalem. The covenant was not broken forever with the destruction and the exile. The covenant was eternal no matter where we go, as long as we had a hope for Jerusalem. That was the turning point. That turning point was 2,590 years ago. And it hasn't flagged since. And that's how Jerusalem got to be the way it is for us today. Questions?
Just two very quick questions.
Yeah.
One, you had said after the exile into Babylonia, but there were still continuing Jewish pockets of.
Yes.
If you could just briefly characterize what Jewish life was like during that.
40 years of exile that was active enforced exile after 586 by the Babylonians. In other words, not as bad as the Romans, like a kill on sight order, but that kind of stuff. But they didn't take everyone to exile. They didn't empty. It wasn't the Nazis in Eastern Poland, where they put all the Jews on cattle cars and took them out.
Or the Romans in 70 AD.
Or the Romans after Bar Kokhba.
132.
132 of the Common Era. Those are the only times that there was an actual erasing of Judaism in the world. What they took to exile was the leaders, all the priests, all the leaders, all the wealthy, they took the whole elite, the whole leadership of the people out into exile in chains, and the podunk farmers they left behind, those guys were still there, and some of the conflict that Ezra and Nehemiah have when they come back is those guys were still there all the time. They're like, who are you to tell me what to do? My grandpappy's been here ever since you got dragged off in humiliation. Why should I build your stinking temple? Right? They've got some of that attitude, conflicting back and forth when they come back. So there's some theory that might be the origin of some of the Samaritans, that they have this sister religion to us with a lot of stuff, and they're centered in Har Gerizim, where the kingdom of Israel was centered, not the kingdom of Judah. They never bought into the Ezra and Nehemiah return, and they ultimately became a separate religion.
And just very briefly, because nowadays in the 20th century, when the Palestinian groups, Arab groups are all saying, well, we were here, So if you could just very briefly summarize after the Romans, who actually controlled until 1948.
After the Romans, oh my God, if I could briefly summarize 1,900 years of history.
Well, it wasn't really that many groups, though, I don't know.
No. The key to it is that during that period of time, first of all, you have the pre-Muslim era under Byzantium. The Byzantium were foreign rulers, but they co-opted native powers. So you have local folks. You have a great deal of people moving through the coastland area. You always did. There's no native group of people. Like people say Palestinian comes from the word Philistine, and the Philistine were the original people in our Bible, and therefore the Palestinians have an older history than us. The Philistines were not from that area. The Philistines were people out of the Mediterranean who were trading along the trade routes and landing there and had ports, and they were by definition foreigners to the land, and a mixed multitude of different cultures in a lot of ways. I mean, you look at their pottery, you look at all the stuff that's left behind, it's just a mix of everything from everywhere. Because that's what that area was, and it continued to be like that through the centuries that you're talking about. So you don't have a static culture. You don't have like an Iroquois reservation where the people are keeping their ways against the world around them. It's very much in flux. Also, it's not densely populated. So you don't really have large urban centers after the kind of collapse of Rome, except in Akko and, yes, Jerusalem and a couple of the other places where the Muslims, like under the Ottomans and so forth later on, you get these kind of large empires who see themselves as settled in those areas. But those are also foreign. Like there's no empire that comes out of that area. There's no governing body that is ever native to anything from the Sea of Galilee to the Nile River to the Gulf of Aqaba. If you take those bodies of water and you take that wedge of land in between there, that is Israel and what will probably be a state of Palestine as well there at some point, that land that we're talking about doesn't have a native power that rules over itself during those 1900 years. Are there people there? Yes. Are many of their descendants living there? Yes. Were some of them Jews? Yes. So, over the course of history, the minority became the majority again. That has happened a lot. There are those who say with the politics of Israel today, our majority could become a minority again with birth rate and everything else, depending on how things go. That's one of the things in play. So, and their cousins came to visit, or lots of them came, I don't know. But I don't think that there's an argument to say that the Palestinian culture, which is a legitimate people and a legitimate culture, of course, with a legitimate claim to a right to live in this area, of course, because their grandparents and grandparents and grandparents were there, and many of them are displaced by war, and no one likes refugees, and that needs a solution, of course. But to say that it has an ancient root that is coherent doesn't make sense. And to say that we don't have an ancient root that is coherent would also not make sense. We have an ancient root that is coherent and unbroken. Does that make our claims superior? Not politically. So people are going to differ on this. Right? We don't have a politically superior logical claim. We have how we feel and we know where it comes from and it's legitimate. And they have what they feel and we know where it comes from and it's legitimate. And they're in conflict. And that's a problem. Right? But it is different. As a matter of culture legacy, it's quite different. Yeah?
You mentioned a couple of names there. I thought I heard Rambam in there at one point that they visited back to Israel.
Yeah.
What years are you talking about?
Well, we have documented.
I mean, are we talking about the 1400s?
We have a literature, for example, of travelogues out of Spain in the 1200s or earlier. Someone out of Spain, like Ibn Dawud himself, did not go to Israel, but he testifies in his books to people who are traders who do go back and forth to Israel. We have some very early literature, 9th, 10th, 11th century Spain, Muslim Spain, talking about rabbis coming out of Israel. We have, of course, Talmud, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century, talking about people coming from Israel or going back and visiting Israel. And we have the heads of the academies in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century also corresponding with people in Israel. And when the academies fell apart under Zoroastrian persecution of the rabbinic academies in what was previously Babylonia, right, in the 900s, 1000s, and the Talmudic age ends and the Gaonic age starts, those people are documenting the flight through and out of Israel. So we have lots of literature from all directions that testify to constant Jewish interaction and crossing through or living in.
Ron, the question is, if it was in the prayers
Yeah,
next year in Jerusalem,
yeah.
why wasn't there a bigger movement, let's say in the year 600, 700, 800, to go back to Jerusalem? The Romans were dead by then as a power.
Yeah.
What prevented it?
Well, it wasn't so easy.
No.
When Yehuda Levi went, he abandoned his family to do it. I don't recommend it, right? So it wasn't easy. I think that's the easiest thing. It was a hard time to live. It was a hard time to travel. It was an unknown. You would be leaping on faith. You would basically have to have a charismatic leader who could convince you all to pool your resources and go together because it's going to be okay. And everyone would have to go along with it. And the brilliance of the Zionist movement was to document where they were buying and what they were going to do there and train people to the jobs before they got there and teach them the language so that the person from Russia could talk to the person from Italy in Hebrew. And the whole pre-Aliyah organization of the World Zionist movement is the brilliance of Zionism, right? And of course, when you get there, you have to be smart to plant things that would grow. That's another story. Right? But the whole idea of Zionism is to prepare and plan to go. And I don't think that in the pre-modern age they had the ability to do that on a large scale. I think this is, look, all politics is economic unless it's religion. Right? All politics is economic. So I talked to the head of the Sochnud, the Jewish agency who's in charge of all international Aliyah. About 10 years ago I talked to this guy. And I had just come from an Argentinian community, and he said, and we were about to visit the Ukrainian community, and he said, yeah, in the Ukraine we're getting 250,000 people a month, whatever it was. And he said, but we don't have anybody signing up anymore. Within 3 years, they won't be coming anymore. And I said, is that because they're all out? And he said, no. It's because salaries have come up in the Ukraine. And salaries are going down in Israel, and the price of apartments is going up in Israel, and the price of apartments is going down in the Ukraine. And the young people think they can make it here now.
Before you're too quick to say, next year in Jerusalem, why didn't they keep moving there? Well, I think the entire ancient world, no one was really moving. People were, it wasn't that easy. People were staying. I mean, in the 20th century, the first
was usually a refugee act.
Yeah, the first migration. It is amazing that there were movement to Israel in the beginning of the 20th century, because I don't think people were moving anywhere. They were
until the rise of Islam. The period, you have this period, this Byzantine period, and then pre-Crusader period. You don't really have wars of conquest in that area. And while the Crusaders are wars of conquest, they're from far away. And they're not really coming and taking over the land. They're like building a castle and hunkering down inside it. They're not really settling the land. The idea that you would conquer a land and take it over, which is the biblical model of the ancient world. It is European colonialism, for example. And it is, in some ways, what one aspect of modern Zionism became. Right? That was not what was happening in that middle 1,000 years that you're talking about. The Crusades were there. Islam took over, but it wasn't people from Babylonia living in North Africa when the Caliphate got control over North Africa. The model of Alexander the Great won. Alexander the Great set up a model where you conquer from afar and you set up local people who rule and they pay you taxes. And that's really what happened in that part of the world for almost 2,000 years after Alexander the Great. And they accuse us of that. In some sense, you have to understand, we're the great invaders. We are foreign people who came and took the land to stay and got rid of that. That's not what has been happening there for a couple thousand years. That is certainly historically shocking. For some of us, it's also historically miraculous. But you have to understand the facts, and then you can have your opinion. Fair? Anybody mad at the presentation? Okay, then we should do my review, because I didn't mean to run this late, and I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry, okay? Let's make sure we have them in